Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislators webinar, Multi-Sector Public-Private Partnerships, How P3s Can Help Provide Public Infrastructure. Today's webinar is the second webinar in NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's 2016 Spring Webinar Series. As part of the series, the committee will host a new webinar every other Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern, meaning our next webinar will be on May 12th, and it will focus on state water infrastructure. For a complete schedule and registration details, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. My name is Kevin Pula. I'm a policy specialist at with NCSL's transportation program, and I'll be your moderator for today. I will begin by providing an overview of state P3 laws, and then I'll be followed by Representative Leslie Combs from Kentucky, who will discuss her experience with P3 legislation in the state. Following Representative Combs will be Ben Hush of NCSL, who will provide a federal update on P3s. And then lastly, we'll hear from Carlson, who will share information on NCSL's upcoming P3 partnership. Before I begin with today's content, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We'll send out a notice shortly after the webinar with a link to these resources. Additionally, you can download the slides being used today by clicking on the library icon. It's yellow and blue in the upper right portion of your screen. And of course, please feel free to submit a question at any time by typing it into the chat box on the left. We will hold Q&A after our speakers finish presenting. But back to why we are here today. I think the title really says it all, but basically over the next 45 or so minutes, our speakers will discuss public-private partnership legislation, how states are considering to use P3s to deliver public infrastructure projects, and NCSL's upcoming activities on the topic. I will begin the webinar with a look at P3 legislation in the states and provide a brief history of P3s in the U.S. and their move from transportation to other types of infrastructure. I'd like to first speak briefly about what NCSL sees as the core aspects of a P3. One complexity of public-private partnerships is the fact that an exact definition is difficult to nail down. The term P3 is used to describe a wide range of procurement and project delivery methods. Ambiguity from the use of this term can lead to confusion amongst lawmakers, the public, and between jurisdictions. At its core, a P3 is an alternative procurement method in which a public agency partners with a private sector entity in order to leverage private resources and expertise through the transfer of risk. P3s are agreements that allow private companies to take on traditionally public roles in infrastructure projects while allowing the public sector to continue to ensure accountability to the public. The Office of Innovative Program Delivery, a division of the Federal Highway Administration, defines public-private partnerships as a contractual agreement formed between a public agency and a private sector entity that allows for greater private sector participation in the delivery and financing of transportation projects. That definition is very specific to transportation, but the general concept of the greater private sector participation can hold true for P3s for other types of infrastructure. When considering the usefulness of P3s, it is important to keep in mind a few things. This is by no means a cure-all for our infrastructure investment woes. This is not a funding source, but rather a tool for leveraging existing or future funding. And the transfer and balance of risk is essential, as in we need to identify which party can best manage a particular form of risk. NCSL has been a leader in the P3 policy research for over a decade. In 2008, the Transportation Program and the NCSL Foundation came together to conduct P3 programming for lawmakers and ultimately produced the 2010 P3 Toolkit for legislators. This highly respected report is seen as a valuable tool by lawmakers and private industry alike. Over the past 6 years, NCSL has actively tracked P3 legislation and trends in state houses across the country and recently released the P3 Statute Analysis. This one-of-a-kind report provides an in-depth categorization and analysis of state-enabling legislation from the 34 states, Puerto Rico, and D.C. with such laws. Statutes are examined across nearly 40 metrics and provisions, allowing legislators and stakeholders to easily identify common provisions, policy trends, and new ideas. In response to recent legislation and general market activity, NCSL will be launching the new Foundation Partnership on Multi-Sector P3s in June. You will hear a little later on from Carlson about this initiative. While P3s in the U.S. have historically been centered on transportation, states are now exploring their use for other sectors. This partnership will examine changing laws, local options, and new policy questions and concerns. I'd like to now transition to speak about the infrastructure needs in America. There is no shortage of coverage on the backlog of public infrastructure repair and the growing need for new infrastructure development. The very heavily cited ASCE report card examines not only transportation networks, but all types of public infrastructure. This analysis gave the U.S. as a whole a D+ for our infrastructure assets. According to the Congressional Budget Office, public spending, or rather spending by federal, state, and local governments on transportation and water infrastructure totaled $416 billion in 2014. It's important to note that most of that spending came from state and local governments. They provided $320 billion, and the federal government accounted for about $96 billion. Further, nominal public spending on infrastructure assets has increased by 44% since 2003. But because prices of materials and other inputs rose more quickly than nominal spending, real inflation-adjusted public purchases decreased, falling by 9% from their peak in 2003 to the level in 2014. As you can see from the map on the screen, 34 states, Puerto Rico, and D.C. have enabling legislation for transportation P3s. The majority of these are now considered comprehensive or broad legislation, while a number of states still have limited or project-specific P3 laws. Some states, such as Colorado and Indiana, first enacted project-specific legislation and subsequently enacted more broad enabling laws. When looking at legislation enabling P3s for all types of infrastructure, the number of states increases to 38. With the enactment of Kentucky House Bill 309, Kentucky now has both non-transportation and transportation P3 authority. We'll hear more about that bill in a few minutes. One of the resources I mentioned earlier, NCSL's categorization and analysis of P3 enabling legislation, examines commonly addressed provisions in these laws. While some apply to only transportation, on the screen now are some common provisions which are often addressed in legislation for P3s for any type of infrastructure. A few that I'd like to discuss briefly include unsolicited or solicited proposals. Rather, the ability for the private industry to approach a state or public agency about a proposal for a P3 agreement. This could be for new or existing infrastructure. Also of great importance are the provisions about legislative involvement, specifically whether lawmakers will have the ability to approve, review, or study P3 projects throughout the life of the project. Followed closely is the role of public input. Ensuring a robust public outreach process is imperative to ensuring the interests and needs of the public are met. Other important provisions include the creation of P3 advisory bodies or centers of excellence within a state and statutory language concerning labor issues. A critical role for legislators is to balance potential benefits of a public-private partnership against the potential concerns or pitfalls. This consideration is imperative in determining the framework for allowing P3s in a state, or whether a state decides to wade down this path at all. As you can see, the list of concerns that NCSL has observed from legislators is not short or insignificant. Difficult questions will need to be asked at the onset, and constant review of the statutory framework is paramount. As I will discuss in the next few slides, some recent legislation has sought to alleviate some of these concerns. On the screen now are recently passed pieces of P3 legislation. Two that I'd like to speak to briefly are Georgia House Bill 59 and Virginia House Bill 1886. Georgia, in 2015, passed House Bill 59, which will expand the P3 authority to allow localities and municipal jurisdictions to enter into P3s. Also was included the authority to enter into non-transportation projects. The bill goes on to create a guideline committee and to establish procedures for unsolicited proposals. Now, Virginia has over 2 decades of experience with P3s. However, in 2015, they felt it important to improve their process. Virginia House Bill 1886 created the Transportation P3 Advisory Committee, which ensures the public benefit of the project at the onset. Additionally, it is provided with a process of checks and balances throughout the life of the P3 in order to ensure the continued public benefit from the project. In addition to this chart, additional bills were passed in Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania in recent years. Also of note is California's P3 legislation, which was first passed in 1989 and is set to sunset in 2017, potentially ending the state's ability to utilize P3s for transportation projects. Currently, the legislature is considering a bill to extend this authority beyond next year. Now on the screen are some pending P3 bills. Tennessee currently has limited P3 authority, and the legislature is considering Tennessee's Senate Bill 2093, which has passed the Senate and will move on to the House and will provide broad enabling P3 authority in the state. Additionally, both chambers of the Hawaii legislature have approved Senate Bill 1228, which would allow for the limited use of public-private partnerships by the State Procurement Office. The New Hampshire legislature is considering Senate Bill 549, which would allow for P3 procurement. This comes following 2015 legislation, which created a P3 study committee. Lawmakers in Iowa, Illinois, and Pennsylvania have introduced vertical P3 legislation in 2016. However, none of these bills have moved past the first committee. Next, we're going to hear from Kentucky Representative Leslie Combs. She will be sharing the Bluegrass State's story of passing P3 legislation. Representative Combs has served the 94th District in Eastern Kentucky since 2006. She is the chairwoman of the House Budget Review Subcommittee on Transportation, as well as a member of the House Appropriations and Review Committee. A graduate of Transylvania University, Representative Combs has had a successful career prior to the State House as the Vice President for Administrative Operations at the University of Pikeville and as the Chief Accountant at the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. She also served 6 years as a director on the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and twice served as the president of the Pike County Chamber of Commerce. Representative Combs has been a champion for P3s in Kentucky. In the last 3 legislative sessions, she has sponsored P3 enabling legislation for the transportation sector. And in 2014, she successfully navigated her bill through the legislature only to have it vetoed by then Governor Beshear due to concerns about tolling and project-specific language. Just this month, however, Governor Bevin signed a very similar law after it was passed by the legislature. We have made available the language in Kentucky House Bill 309, and you may download it now using the library icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And also, please don't forget to submit your questions in the chat box to the left. Representative, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Appreciate that and appreciate the introduction, and welcome to all that are on the webinar with us today. Very excited to talk about P3 in Kentucky because it's been 4 long legislative years of getting this legislation passed. And there's a story to be told, and that's the story I'll tell because I found out that providing information to folks through a story is more enjoyable than the boring details that take place and actually making the sausage, as they talk about. And something I want to reference this P3 bill with right off the bat. You know that old saying, things happen for a reason, and I think we have incurred the issues and tribulations throughout the last 4 legislative sessions in trying to get this bill passed that indeed things did happen for a reason for us to end up with what I think is a very successful bill in the end. Before I continue, there's a participant on this webinar with us today who's actually watching or taking part in this as a guest that I couldn't go any further without mentioning. We're very fortunate in Kentucky and in the Kentucky legislature to have what we refer to as the Kentucky Legislative Research Commission. They are a nonpartisan group of staff members that obviously help both sides of the aisles in drafting and helping us through the workings of legislation. And one of the members of this LRC staff is Eric Kennedy. And I must say that he and I have kind of grown up in the P3 world together, if I'm allowed to put it that way. And I attribute great authorship to him as well, and consider him now to be, and I think he considers himself to be, an expert in P3 legislation now. So he has had a lot to do with helping us work through to completion and to success over the last 4 years. So let me start with the history of P3 in Kentucky and how we got to where we are today. We started out 4 years ago in 2013 in that legislative session. A very good friend of mine, Representative Sandy Overly, who is Majority Caucus Chair Leader in the Kentucky House of Representatives, had the position prior to that position of being Majority Caucus Chair, of being the Budget Review or the Budget Subcommittee Chair of Transportation, as I am today. And so at that time, in 2013, we were talking about the fact that P3s were of interest in Kentucky. Maybe it was time for public-private partnerships to be introduced in Kentucky. And, of course, at that point in time, we were only referencing transportation projects. So she and I got together and decided to co-sponsor a P3 piece of legislation just for transportation projects to see what the interest was in Kentucky and to see if indeed there was an interest in P3 for transportation and possibly for other areas where P3 could be used. And sure enough, we introduced that bill not anticipating any success in 2013, but we really wanted to see what kind of feedback we would get. So sure enough, we introduced it, and we got lots of feedback, lots of very positive feedback, not only on the transportation sector, but indeed there was an interest out there for other P3 avenues as well. So even though there was no movement at all on that piece of legislation in 2013, that told us what we needed to do. So over the interim of 2013 leading into the 2014 session, I decided to take the lead and take the charge and began to delve into educating myself on P3 projects and P3 legislation across the country. And with the assistance of many, like Eric, who I mentioned earlier, I kind of took over and drafted the comprehensive P3 legislative language for Kentucky. Now, obviously, I did not do this by myself. I had a lot of input from a great group of people, mainly led by the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. They put together and devised a major coalition, and this coalition consisted of not only full endorsement by the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, but also by KLC, the Kentucky League of Cities. So there was and the CATO, which is Kentucky Association of County Officials. So there was your local component. We involved various businesses and their lobbyists associated with those individual groups. And the Kentucky Chamber put together a whole coalition that came together and actually put together a campaign to move forward and say, we buy P3. That is our number one piece of legislation in that year, 2014, and we're going to move this forward. And they did it. They put together actually a campaign advertising budget. I'll tell a funny story on that because before I could even, what we refer to as drop the bill, but before I could even file the legislation, one morning I was driving in from Lexington, Kentucky to Frankfort to the Capitol, and that's about a 45-minute ride for those who may not know. And as soon as I took the exit into Frankfort, there was a big billboard awaiting me that said, why not P3s in Kentucky? And I thought, boys, give me a chance to drop the bill first. So anyhow, very shortly thereafter, we knew that there was a lot of support behind it, and we did and we did indeed file the legislation, the comprehensive bill that therefore provided public-private partnerships for local governments, state agencies, as well as the transportation piece. Now, this piece of legislation ran into a little hitch right off the bat, and that had to do with a project, and it has been the one and only project that has really caused this piece of legislation problem in its entirety, and that is a bridge up in northern Kentucky that connects Kentucky to Cincinnati, and concerned by a group of folks in Cincinnati that they don't want tolls, period. They don't want tolls, period. And while that bridge still has some life left in it, here and probably inside of 10 years, it will probably need to be reconstructed and really, and it's a very, very expensive bridge. At this point in time, I venture to say it's probably upwards of about $2.5 billion. And I don't exactly know how we're going to do that, but right now there was such opposition to that from legislators and the people of northern Kentucky. Even though there's a group up there that are for it, there was a greater voice against it. So in amending the 2014 original language, we did an amendment that exempted that bridge from being considered MP3 legislation. As a result of that, it passed overwhelmingly in both chambers, both the House and the Senate. But by the time it got to the governor's desk, the governor wanted specifically P3 legislation, transportation legislation, to be able to use on that bridge. And by that bridge having been exempted from that piece of legislation, he vetoed that P3 bill after it successfully made its way through both chambers. While we could have overridden the governor's veto, that was in the middle of a budget year and a lot of other issues at the very last minute crunching down on us. And we decided to leave the P3 legislation to another year. Even though we got it that far, we knew that it had that kind of support. So we got into 2015. At that point in time, over the interim, the governor came to me, Governor Beshear at the time, came to me and said, let me work with you on P3. So I heeded to the governor's wishes, and I sat down with his staff, and we redrafted P3 legislation. He was not as lenient as we were in the prior year with the local P3 piece. He had certain parts of the state P3 piece that he didn't like, but he thought he had language that would satisfy the folks in Kentucky. Well, we tried it his way, and Governor Beshear was my governor, and I appreciate his service for the last 8 years to the state of Kentucky. But we tried it his way that year in 2015, and I must say that regardless of his change that he thought would be accepted by the folks in northern Kentucky, there was great outcry by them against this specific project in any way, shape, or form. Therefore, we went through the committee process. This bill went through the Appropriations and Revenue Committee, which was a great, that was a tremendous debate that day, but we came out of it successfully. But when I got the legislation to the House floor, one of my own colleagues on my side of the aisle, but he was a legislator from northern Kentucky, and he was adamant, totally adamant. He will tell you to this day he's still adamant against tolls. He put up 13 amendments against the P3 bill on the House floor. Well, we decided to take them on and fight them one by one. I think I'm right on this number. One of them may not have been called up, but I know that out of all those amendments, he fought, I believe, almost all of them, maybe with the exception of one. And I was able to defeat all but three. And three of them had to do with various different ways that you might readdress the financing avenue of building this bridge and building other bridges and transportation projects. But basically, we did make it out of the House with three of those 13 amendments on the bill. But we still passed it 89 to whatever. We have 100 members in the House of Representatives, so it overwhelmingly passed, even though I think we had about a 2.5-hour debate on the floor over those amendments. So it went down to the Senate, and there's even a stronger contingent and voice in the Senate that represents folks in a certain political area of northern Kentucky. So I must say that in 2015, even with these attempted changes, try to accommodate this one particular project, it stalled in the Senate. And in addition to that, it also, we call it the three-legged stool. It was missing a leg, and that was the local option piece of the P3, because by that point in time, the governor was not willing to make certain exceptions that local government agencies wanted to see, and therefore they decided to step aside, because in Kentucky they have what they refer to at the local level as home rule, as though they had their own ways of doing P3. And even though we tried to explain and educate that without statutory P3 language, the public sector that will invest in P3s, as you all know, a lot of times will not take the risk at the level you need without the statutory support of the state behind it. So needless to say, it stalled in the Senate. While you never ever give up, I was willing for the, I guess, for P3 to survive. I was willing to step aside this most recent year, 2016, in this session. But back during the interim, the Chamber of Commerce, State Chamber, came to me again and said, no, we want you to spearhead it once again. And we're going to try to put our coalition back together as it was year before last. And sure enough, they did. And we put all three legs of the stool back together, and we put the coalition back together. And we came back through, and once again, we exempted that famous bridge in northern Kentucky from being considered in this legislation. And as a result, yes, some of the things that were mentioned earlier, concerns about transparency, the general concerns that every state has, I think this legislation addresses. And that's another kudo I want to give my friend Nri Kennedy, the LRC staff person. We both, between both of us and my counterpart, actually helped out greatly, Senator Max Wise in the Senate, who carried this piece of legislation over there. Between the three of us, we put our heads together and tried to address all the concerns that the public had out there. And we think as a result of finally getting this through with the 4 years of experience that we put into it, that we've come up with not only the most comprehensive, but the strongest and most transparent piece of P3 legislation that's out there in the country today. So with that, that's how we got here. Now, I know one of the subject areas that they wanted me to stress was the fact that when I say comprehensive, realize, yes, we started out 4 years ago with the transportation idea, but we brought this thing all the way through. And it was always important and imperative to me that we have all three legs of that stool, the local and the state agency piece, as well as the transportation piece. And here's why. I can't answer other states, but I sure can answer to Kentucky, and particularly where I come from in far eastern Kentucky. Our cities and our counties are struggling. It's all they can do just to make day-to-day ends meet. As they say, like a normal family, they're living paycheck to paycheck. The infrastructure is crumbling around them. They're not able to offer water and sewer and other infrastructure needs that these areas need. They need help and they need assistance. There's only so much of it right now. You know, when we look at local dollars, when we look at state dollars, and when we look at federal dollars, they're dissipating right in front of us and being absorbed, and there's just not enough to go around these days. So, as was mentioned earlier, this is not considered to be money or cash. It is another financing tool that can be used. The risk can be taken. The borrowing authority can be assumed by another entity. And all of these things can be done in agreement with these different agencies, whether it be local, state, or at the transportation level, that you can go into these very complex agreements to the protection of all. And when I talk about transparency, it was one thing that was the number one priority on top for me. And in this legislation, that's what we've done, is we've gone to great lengths to make sure that this P3 legislation and any contracts that are entered into at any level are very transparent, very open to the public, and that not only will we accommodate the needs for these different sectors wherever they might be, but that they're being done to the protection of the taxpayers. So with that, I'll leave it open to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Representative Combs. That was very informative. We will hold any questions till the end, but it is always good to hear not only about the legislative campaign, as you spoke about, but also that need in Kentucky that you see being alleviated or potentially partially alleviated by P3s in the state. So we look forward to hearing your response to some of these questions towards the end. And as a reminder, you can type your question into the chat box in the lower left at any time, and we will hold them till the end of the presentations. Now we're pleased to have with us Ben Hush, NCSL's Nri Committee Director. Ben will be providing a brief update on how the federal government has been supporting states' efforts to use public-private partnerships. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you again, Representative Combs. So just a quick plug for the Nri Committee, which stands for Natural Resources and Infrastructure, which covers transportation, energy, environment, and agriculture. And the Nri Committee is one of 8 NCSL standing committees, which really, the primary goal is both to track federal action, be it at the congressional or administrative level, as well as to advocate and lobby on behalf of state legislatures. So this issue specifically to advocate, on the benefits and the impacts of P3s and the ability of states to utilize them. So I just want to mention a couple points you can see up on the slide. The first one is the FAST Act, Fixing America's Surface Transportation, which was signed into law last December. And was a 5-year reauthorization of surface transportation programs. And one kind of core area that I want to focus on is the TIFIA program, or the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Program. And really what that program is kind of designed to do is to provide loans or loan guarantees, lines of credit, really to help finance significant national or regional infrastructure projects. And as part of the FAST Act, funding for that program was actually cut pretty significantly from $1 billion annually to $275 million in what is now 2016, increasing slightly to $300 million over the next 5 years. And while this decrease does potentially limit what really has been a primary source of federal support for transportation projects, really the new funding levels kind of combined with what was left over from previous allocations, still provides pretty significant opportunities for states to engage in P3s. And a couple other notes on that is previously, prior to the FAST Act, the project threshold was, in order to qualify for a TIFIA loan, was $25 million, and that was actually lowered as part of the FAST Act to $10 million. So obviously a number of other projects potentially qualify, as well as now transit-oriented development projects can now qualify for TIFIA loan. And the other kind of piece of the FAST Act to understand as it relates to P3s is that surface transportation program funds can be used to create state-dedicated P3 offices. And P3 offices really have the ability to increase a state's capacity to pursue P3s, as well as to ensure the public's interest is being upheld. You heard Representative Combs talk a lot about transparency, and P3 offices, state P3 offices can really help in that regard. The next point on there that I want to talk about, EPA's community-based P3s. NCSL works very closely with the Environmental Protection Agency on a number of environmental issues. Recently, EPA supported community-based public-private partnership model, which was used actually by Prince George County, Maryland, a neighbor of Washington, D.C., to partner with Corvius Solutions to provide enhanced stormwater management and green infrastructure. And here in the D.C. office, we're kind of keeping an eye on EPA's work in this field. If you're interested in additional information on funding or financing for water infrastructure, I would really encourage everyone on the phone to join us in 2 weeks. As Kevin mentioned, the next webinar in the NRI series will focus specifically on water infrastructure, so I would definitely encourage everyone to join. The Build America Transportation Investment Center, or BATIC, as we like to refer to it, at least in emails, kind of is a division within the Federal Department of Transportation, and really kind of serves as a single point of contact and coordination for municipalities, project sponsors, really looking to utilize federal transportation expertise, as well as apply for federal transportation credit programs, or really just in general to kind of explore ways to access private capital as it pertains to public-private partnerships. And BATIC actually just recently released a report entitled Successful Practices for P3s. And this report examines a number of provisions that they found to be important for state P3 legislation. And actually the report really complements what Kevin highlighted earlier, NCSL's P3 statute analysis. It highlights a number of the same provisions, including the creation of P3 offices, legislative involvement in public-private partnerships, as well as provisions to be included in P3 contracts that allow for flexibility in the public-private partnership process. And finally, the BATIC Institute. NCSL is a partner in the BATIC Institute, along with the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, which we acronize as AASHTO. Those are your state DOT officials. In addition, the American Public Transportation Association, as well as a few other consulting firms. And the Institute, which was specifically authorized by MAP 21, provides technical assistance to state lawmakers, stakeholders, and state DOTs on project finance issues. And the Institute really, coordinates with a larger BATIC effort and kind of, highlighting how P3s have been a main topic of the Institute. And I really want to point out two specific webinars that the Institute actually already held that have been released. You can listen to recordings of them. And the first one highlights Pennsylvania's Rapid Bridge Replacement Program, or P3, excuse me. And the second one highlights the Denver Union Station P3. And actually coming up in probably about 2 weeks now, they will hold a third webinar highlighting the Denver Eagle Transit P3. And you can learn, really more about the BATIC Institute, as well as listen to the recordings of the webinars I just mentioned at www.financingtransportation.org. And with that, Kevin, I'll turn it back over to you. I hope I covered everything.
Thanks a lot, Ben. That was good, and it's nice to see that we can hear what the states are doing, but then also see what is happening in DC on this topic. So, lastly, we are pleased to have Caroline Carlson, who is the NCSL Foundation's Director of Development, and she's going to be telling us a little bit more about the foundation and an upcoming project at NCSL to explore P3 policy. Caroline, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. So our NCSL Foundation does a number of what we call public-private partnerships, separate from the P3s and the transportation and other infrastructure world, but where we bring together state legislators and legislative staff and the private sector sponsors to really delve into a topic for a year to 18 months. And this gives us a chance to bring all parties and stakeholders to the table to examine an issue further. So I'm really excited that we are able to kick off a partnership on multi-sector P3s. And our kickoff meeting is going to be in Minneapolis in conjunction with the P3 Hub Midwest meeting on June 1st. And for those of you who are interested in that, you can talk to Kevin and I after this call. But we're really excited that our steering committee is going to launch this project there. And then we're also going to meet at the NCSL Legislative Summit, which is happening this summer in Chicago, August 8th through the 11th. And we also plan to meet again at the NCSL Capitol Forum, which will be in Washington, D.C., December 6th through the 9th. And then again, we plan to continue to meet into 2017, but we do not have a firm date yet. But this is an ongoing project, and we know that we'll meet again in conjunction with another meeting on P3s or an NCSL standalone meeting. So as you can see from the slide, we have co-chairs from both parties, Senator Scott Dibble and Representative Ed Soliday, and we're still putting together private sector parties. Our private sector partners are there as well, but we're still fundraising for the project, and we feel that we're going to have a very robust conversation on P3s. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. I just want to quickly share with everyone, Caroline and Ben's contact information is on the screen now, and you can always feel free to reach out to them directly, or myself, and my information will be on at the end of the webinar if you have any specific questions related to the topics they talked about today. Here's my information as well. But I'd like to now shift gears to the final portion of today's webinar, which is a question and answer. We do have a few questions that have come in, and you can always still add to the conversation by adding questions to the chat box on the bottom left. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to participants afterwards. But first, I'd like to take moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. And so Representative Combs, this is for you. I just want to hear a little bit of your thoughts on how do you help ensure the ability of the legislature and lawmakers to adapt and improve P3 authority and provide oversight during the proposal process, or even as the state enters into these long-term contracts. I know that's one of the a criticism that we often hear is that the state's hands can potentially be tied with a 30-year, or there's a threat of them being tied with a 30, 40-year contract for operations and maintenance. What have you guys thought about, or how did you work that in your legislation to try and deal with that issue?
That's a very important question, and yes, it was a very big question in Kentucky and a big concern. So we did import that into the legislation at various different levels. There are, particularly the state agency levels, and there are dollar amount levels on different ones of these. I won't get into the details of that because that is in the legislation. But there are certain projects and certain cost levels, certain dollar levels that have to come back before the legislature for their actual approval, or before a legislative committee, like Contract Review Committee. In the case of local government, it has to go back before we put together what we call a local government P3 board, which will have oversight by the State Department of Finance. Okay, so they'll have to be overseen by a state agency in an overhaul kind of situation. But this P3 board was put together by locals for the local government contracts to be reviewed by them. And in addition, those contracts have to go back before what we call the Department of Local Government to be reviewed. State agency projects have to go back, have to also be authorized and oversaw through the Department of Finance, as well as, like I said, going through the Legislative Contract Review Committee. So we've got several different levels we've built in there. Also, at the transportation levels, there are dollar thresholds, and it has to be approved by the it has to go through the next legislative session to be approved before it can actually be considered a P3 project. So there are various different levels of government approval. Well, when you say approval so much as oversight to make sure that it's meeting certain thresholds that we want to make sure are in there to protect not only those various different agencies that may be engaging in these contracts, but they're also, like we said, protecting the taxpayer and protecting all that are involved on both ends. And to make sure that a good contract's being put together and that the money's properly being spent for what it's intended to be spent for.
Thank you. You mentioned quickly that the transportation projects have to go back to the State Finance Board for review, or what you said, approval, is that prior to the kind of bidding and team selection process, or is that in the proposal and at multiple points?
It's at multiple points in the process because we also we have unsolicited bid proposals in there, and we have a section laid out for how that will be addressed and the oversight there. So that because that was one of the big key issues and requests that obviously various entities wanted in the P3 process was unsolicited proposals, and you get a lot of creative ideas from those unsolicited proposals. So you certainly don't want to, I guess, keep yourself from being allowed to have those. But at the same time, you want certain protections built in to those unsolicited proposals and how they will be reviewed. So, like I said, it's very cumbersome. I've had to go through various different layers of the legislation to explain that, but there are safeguards built in to protect and actually have a little bit of oversight and say before those things actually go to fruition.
All right, thank you. That's very interesting. I know that other states have had struggled with that exact topic, and we see, like I mentioned, in Virginia, they tweaked their laws recently, and NCSL is right here in Denver and Colorado, and Colorado's gone through a lot of these hurdles as well to try and figure out an amenable process for doing just that.
We actually looked at Virginia quite a bit and utilized some of the suggestions made in Virginia and utilized some of their language as well.
That's great to hear, and that's what we've seen. We've seen that often, states looking towards others maybe more experienced or who have a greater number of years in this area, and that's kind of what we hope to do with the partnership that Caroline spoke about, is bringing these capacity building to all the states, not just the ones who've been around doing this for a long time. I want to move on to another question that came through. There's a question about are there any examples of smaller municipalities, towns, and villages that have taken advantage of P3s? That's a very interesting question. I'm going to try and tackle it here, and please feel free to chime in, Representative, if you have any thoughts. But one issue with P3s that is trying to be sorted out by public officials, groups like NCSL, and also private industries is the scalability of P3s. There's a lot of contractual work and finance expertise that goes into these complex deals or contracts. And so the idea of scaling one down to a small municipality can sometimes be cumbersome, and trying to get the public officials there the wherewithal to be able to do something like this is a substantial task. And that's where the P3 advisory bodies come in within the states, or the centers of excellences or the offices within a state to assist a municipality or a town to do this. Ben talked briefly about the EPA working with Prince George County, Maryland, and they came together and had them do kind of a bundling of different stormwater projects. It wasn't just one thing. So this idea of bundling is something that we think that our partnership can explore over the next year. How might a state facilitate a number of municipalities or counties to bundle a similar need together? The other way bundling could happen is what we've seen in Long Beach, California. They're doing the Long Beach Civic Center, where they're bundling a number of different types of infrastructure. The P3 that they entered into this year, it's going to deliver a public courthouse, or not a courthouse, but a public building, public office space. It's going to incorporate retail locations in the downtown sector. It's going to have a public park, and it's also going to provide needed infrastructure upgrades at their port of Long Beach. So that's another type of bundling done by a municipality. And I don't know if that's an issue you guys have talked about, Representative Combs, in Kentucky, or what you see is happening in the local level there.
No, these are the exact examples that have been discussed, and are actually, since we passed this legislation, it's all kind of been hinging on passing this legislation of doing a lot of these examples that you're talking about. I know that immediately some of the issues that I know a lot of our local governments want to deal with are water and sewer projects and of course, like you said, the stormwater issues. But bundling, regional bundling of projects and services are some things that have been discussed. So the very examples are exactly what have been talked about in Kentucky and how we will utilize P3 financing and being able to do that.
And I will add too that and this fits very well with Ben, your guys' next webinar next week or 2 weeks on on water infrastructure. But I believe some towns in Wisconsin have looked towards P3s as a way to fix any old water delivery lines. Like with the crisis in Flint, Michigan, this has become a hotter topic across the country, but it's been a way to retrofit municipal water systems to remove lead or corroded pipes and things like that. And so obviously that's going to just become a larger part of the conversation over the next year. Do have another question that was asked about any themes that we've seen in 2016 P3 legislation. I think there's kind of two things that I've observed over recent years. One theme is the states that do not currently have robust P3 enabling legislation that are looking to either study this, like New Hampshire did in 2015, and Hawaii has studied this in the past. So there's those states trying to come on board and explore whether they want to go down the path of P3s. And then the other theme is experienced states like Virginia and Colorado and Pennsylvania and Florida who have had long-standing P3 legislation, but they've decided to tweak it and make some adjustments to that, specifically dealing with transparency, public outreach, and public involvement throughout the life of a P3 process.
I'd like to chime in on that too, as a theme, and I assume this referred to as a theme, but as an issue as well. And you've mentioned it, and that is the transparency. That's why it was so important for us, because there have been some horror stories in the past associated with various P3 initiatives in various different states and their success rate with it. And some of our folks in the legislature had heard those, our other legislators had heard those horror stories, and we're very concerned about, or some of them had great concern about their support for P3 legislation, and that's why we were so bent on making sure that we had the transparencies built in and the oversights built in, because we had important P3 financing was as far as another tool in the toolkit. But at that same time, we wanted nothing to do with the wrong way of doing P3s. We wanted to do it the right way. So as far as the theme that we saw consistently and concerns expressed, it was around the transparency, and that's why I like to emphasize the need for transparency and the need for those transparent loopholes to be put in there and to be the protection for the taxpayers.
Thank you for that insight, Representative. All right, we are just about getting to 2 o'clock Eastern and time to wrap up. 3 o'clock, I'm sorry. And so I'd like to extend a final thank you to our speakers. And of course, thanks to all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and presentation slides will be made available online. And our next webinar will be 2 weeks from today, focused on state water infrastructure. And to register or find out more information, please visit ncsl.org or send me a quick email. Thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and have a great day.